B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Tuesday, September 19th, 2017. Right here in San Francisco yesterday, Nancy Pelosi, a member of Congress and the Democratic leader, the minority leader of the House, held a news conference to celebrate Dreamers and to promote the deal that she and Chuck Schumer made with Trump about enacting DACA into law. And it didn't really work out the way Pelosi, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, and my member of Congress, Jared Huffman, had hoped it would.
Do you want to hear an answer, or do you just want to shout?
And as I've told you before, I once worked as a political advisor to Congresswoman Pelosi before she entered the leadership.
As we fight the fight.
And I have to say that it pains me to see the way she fumbled this shout down by the Dreamers.
I don't want any answers, because you've had your say, and it's beautiful to our ears to hear your protection, your self-dignity. But I'm not. Hey, if you don't. Hey, stop it. Just stop it now. Just stop it now. Just stop it now. Let's stop it now.
Now, this is like she's talking to her kids or her grandchildren.
You can.
And it's a big mistake.
To what? To what? Of course. Yes, I am. You do not.
They're calling her a liar, and she's saying, you don't know what you're talking about. And Pelosi was not permitted to speak. She and the other members left, and they did face a much more friendly crowd at they went in the afternoon to Sacramento State and spoke to a group of Dreamers there. But first of all, I want to point out, as I have before, that the Dreamers have been converted into a group of hostages. And I consider this to be really cruel and cynical on the part of Donald Trump. Because the way he handled this, by setting a deadline, tossing the hot potato to Congress, which has fumbled it repeatedly in the past, and expecting some kind of a decent outcome, is really bizarre. And while I find it, just downright objectionable that Trump would treat this group of young people as hostages, it then becomes sordid that Pelosi and Schumer would make deals. Now, their intentions are good. They're trying to protect this group of people with some form of legislation. They're willing to compromise, not on the wall, but on other issues related to so-called border security, in order to protect the Dreamers. But the Dreamers properly point out that they are being treated as a bargaining chip. And one of the signs that they held wrote, it said, fight for all 11 million. So the Dreamers are demanding comprehensive immigration reform from a minority party. And on that note, they are politically off base. But their aspirations are not. There were also people who pointed out that Pelosi was silent as Barack Obama presided over the deportation of millions of undocumented people while he served in the White House. And so I fully understand the hostility, the anger and frustration. And one of the group's organizers, Luis Serrano, said, I know some people think this hurts the cause of undocumented folks, but undocumented people will always be scapegoated. Pushing Democrats to take a more progressive stance is how we got DACA in the first place. We believe in pushing people who say they're on our side, not those who are not. Well, you can quibble with the strategy. But it is really understandable that they believe that they are simply pawns in a big game that they have no power over. And Nancy Pelosi, they hope, by shaming her in this public way, the same way Black Lives Matter people interrupted Bernie Sanders. It was in Seattle, I believe, during the campaign last year. The hope is that after the rudeness of the moment passes, that Pelosi will take away a strong message that the Dreamers are not just a passive group of people who can be treated in an undignified manner. And while, again, I do believe that these negotiations that have essentially created a hostage group are really offensive, we're now stuck with this, and we have to look for a way forward. I've got a couple of items that are inconvenient to the Trump narrative. One is about the opportunity for people to illegally cross our southern border. Now, consider the source, but the Trump Department of Homeland Security is trumpeting, sorry, I didn't mean to say that, is drawing attention to new statistics saying that 55 to 85% of attempted illegal border crossings are unsuccessful, up from the range of 35 to 70% 10 years ago. They report that the number of illegal migrants and deportees who make repeated attempts to get in has also fallen dramatically because many of them are giving up. So, I do not celebrate this news. I think of the hardships many people face, and they're willing to accept them trying to come into the United States seeking a better life. But this begs the question, why the fuck do we need a wall if 85% of illegal migrants are not successful in crossing the border? That, of course, is a question that will linger because it conflicts with the Trump mythology. Now we have a report from the Health and Human Services Department, and they did an in-depth study about the impact of refugees and whether on a net basis they contribute more than they cost. And over a 10-year period, the calculation is that refugees brought in $63 billion more in government revenues than the money that was spent on them. And it's focused on the first 4 years of their entry into the United States. Once again, this conflicts with the Trump narrative that every other refugee is a potential criminal, a potential terrorist, and that we have to heavily vet these people, and the best thing is to send money and allow them to be put into refugee camps either in their home countries or close by. And that brings me to Trump's teleprompter speech to the United Nations General Assembly today. It was bizarre. And it was deeply embarrassing for anyone who cares about the image and reputation of the United States to have this dunderhead up there reciting these platitudes about how he believes in America first, his bizarre, fear-filled vision of the world today, and his selective demonization of certain authoritarian governments while describing, for example, the Saudis as neighbors, good people, and how they welcomed him. And, well, he didn't mention touching that orb, but that's what comes to mind. And so, he paints this dark picture of international criminal networks trafficking drugs, weapons, and people. But isn't that what the CIA does? We've trafficked drugs, like cocaine coming from Central America. We've trafficked weapons, most recently the rat line from Libya to Syria. And, Trump is oblivious to all of the statements he makes that can be interpreted as indictments of the United States and our recent imperialist behavior. And he tries to paint the picture that we're just good guys and we're trying to help the rest of the world and that we are, confronting what he calls rogue regimes. And essentially, this is a rewrite of Bush's speech from, 2003, where he said that we had this axis of evil. It was Iraq, it was Iran, and it was North Korea. Well, Iraq didn't get mentioned because we've sure messed that country up. But North Korea led the scoreboard for Trump's bullying and threats. He says North Korea's reckless pursuit of nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles threatens the entire world with unthinkable loss of human life. So, what does he think of in response? Well, to totally destroy North Korea, which would, Mr. President, involve unthinkable loss of human life. But North Koreans, are not the same. Their lives don't have the same value as, good American lives. The larger quote here, the United States has great strength and patience, but if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and his regime. Now consider this. The Rocket Man phrase, and we'll discuss that again in a moment. We talk about some conservative commentators who took exception to it. But he first launched this in a tweet over the weekend. And based on the satisfaction of his Twitter followers to the epithet Rocket Man, Trump decided it was ready for prime time, ready for the world's greatest diplomatic body. And this is what America has to suffer through, as we are defined by this idiot who occupies the White House. So, by taking on 2/3 of Bush's axis of evil, he of course then had to turn to the Iranian government. Here's a quote. The Iranian government masks a corrupt dictatorship behind the false guise of a democracy. It has turned a wealthy country with a rich history and culture into an economically depleted rogue state whose chief exports are violence, bloodshed, and chaos. The longest-suffering victims of Iran's leaders are, in fact, its own people. Now, I do not believe that Iran is an economically depleted state. Certainly, the sanctions that we imposed had some impact. But his vision of Iran is terribly skewed. He continued, we cannot let a murderous regime continue these destabilizing activities while building dangerous missiles. We cannot abide by an agreement if it provides cover for the eventual construction of a nuclear program. The Iran deal was one of the worst and most one-sided transactions the United States has ever entered into. Frankly, that deal is an embarrassment to the United States, and I don't think you've heard the last of it, believe me. Now, this was likely written, or at least heavily influenced, by Benjamin Netanyahu. And when Trump describes it as a one-sided transaction, he imagines that it was just between the U.S. and Iran. And he also imagines that he can just snap his fingers and widen the scope of the agreement that was painstakingly negotiated with the involvement of 6 countries, the members of the Security Council plus the United States. It's the permanent members, just to be clear. So then he goes on to, say that the Iranian regime is oppressive, and then he praises Saudi Arabia, blowing past all of the oppression that they visit on their own population, on women, on the people of Yemen, to be explicit. In Saudi Arabia early last year, I was greatly honored to address the leaders of more than 50 Arab and Muslim nations. We agreed that all responsible nations must work together to confront terrorists and the Islamist extremism that inspires them. We will stop radical Islamic terrorism because we cannot allow it to tear up our nation and indeed to tear up the entire world. There, he said it. He feels like he just burst a bubble because Barack Obama refused to utter the phrase radical Islamic terrorism for good reason, because it only angers people who are not yet radicalized Islamists. But he's too thick to get that. And then he has to drop the term loser in there. He says the U.S. and our allies are working together throughout the Middle East to crush the loser terrorists. and stop the reemergence of safe havens they use to launch attacks on all of our people. As if calling them losers is going to cause them to curl up and raise a white flag. His worldview is just incredibly bizarre. Oh, and he had to take a swipe at Cuba, and then Venezuela, and then socialism. And basically he's saying that Maduro has to go because he's an authoritarian and that socialism is a failure. Tell that to France, Sweden, Germany, Norway, or any of the other dozens of countries who are socialist democracies. He conflates socialism with communism, declares it a failure, and that was the most awkward moment in his UN speech today, as all of the nations assembled, many of them socialist, just said, "What? You don't know what you're talking about." And at the Washington Post, conservative columnist Jennifer Rubin had a couple of comments here. His language is so cringeworthy as to lower the status and prestige of the United States on the international stage. He quite simply sounds like a child when he says Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself. He's incapable of leaving lingo for low-information voters behind, even when it risks creating doubts about his own maturity and stability. Vowing to utterly destroy North Korea if it doesn't give up its weapons is a reality TV star's image of how powerful leaders talk. In practice, it comes across as cartoonish. And another comment from her. She says he is positively unintelligible on refugees. On one hand, he complains that it's deeply unfair to have uncontrolled migration. Then he praised Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon for taking refugees, but he didn't thank Germany, which has taken 1 million refugees at some considerable expense, and not just financial. And, of course, Bibi Netanyahu immediately issued a statement praising Trump. And as I said, I suspect Bibi wrote part of the speech. In over 30 years in my experience with the UN, I never heard a bolder or more courageous speech. President Trump spoke the truth about the great dangers facing our world and issued a powerful call to confront them in order to ensure the future of humanity. And all Netanyahu wants is war with Iran. And Trump at least pays lip service to that in his bellicose and bizarre speech to the UN. Every day I like to pause for a second and thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. People like, Tim McKay, because he's got 2 subscriptions that come up right in a row here. Jim Garrison, also Carla Mahoney, and many other people. I appreciate your support, and if you're not already a subscriber, here's your chance to get on board. Come on over to peterbcollins.com, click on the menu button and pull it down, then click on Become a Subscriber. It takes you to the sign-up page where you can choose the level of support that's comfortable for you. I got one more quote from Trump's speech because it gives context to my next item. He claimed that we have all but vanquished the Islamic State from Syria and brags that, in 8 months we've made more progress than in many, many years combined. He went on to say, we seek the de-escalation of the Syrian conflict and a political solution that honors the will of the Syrian people. The actions of the criminal regime of Bashar al-Assad, including the use of chemical weapons against his own citizens, even innocent children, shock the conscience of every decent person. No society can be safe if banned chemical weapons are allowed to spread. That's why the U.S. carried out a missile strike on the airbase that launched the attack. Well, today I'm releasing an hour-long in-depth interview with independent investigative journalist Gareth Porter. And Porter has just published a 5,000-word article based on his investigation. It's at Alternet. And he investigated what really happened in Khan Shaykhun, Syria, on April 4th. And he challenges the UN Special Commission of Inquiry on Syria, the Organization for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons, Human Rights Watch, the Trump administration, the corporate media stenographers here in this country, who all just concluded that a chemical release of sarin did occur in Khan Shaykhun on April 4th, and it must have been the Syrian government. And In a painstaking fashion, Porter deconstructs the misleading reports that indicate Syria was responsible, and he raises numerous questions. And in this excerpt from our conversation, he talks about the political impact of claiming that Syria used chemical weapons as recently as April in Khan Shaykhun.
Well, I couldn't agree more with the point that you're making here fundamentally about the political significance of examining with great critical care the claims that have been made about Khan Shaykhun and coming up with a much more reliable account of what happened, because, of course, we know that it was used by President Donald Trump to justify a missile strike in Syria. It was a missile strike which clearly has a much more complicated background politically in terms of the real reason for it, because at that moment Trump was both under great pressure from the Democratic Party and even more so from the commercial news media for his alleged contacts on his behalf, allegedly, with the Russians. And he wanted to find a way to prove that he was not just tough, but perhaps possibly even irrational in his readiness to use force. And so, in a way, the strike in Syria against the Russian airbase at Shayrat was a way of killing more than one bird with a single stone, politically. And so there was a much more complex background of his decision. But clearly, he was riding on a situation in which the media had totally adopted the official line that the local authorities in Khan Shaykhun, the Al-Qaeda franchise in Syria, had put out.
I invite you to listen to the full interview with reporter Gareth Porter. It's released to my subscribers today at peterbcollins.com, iTunes, TuneIn, Stitcher, Spreaker, and most places where you find the Peter B. Collins podcast. We've been providing a little more coverage about the refugee crisis in Myanmar, where the minority Muslim Rohingyas have been forced out of the province called Rakhine, and they are en masse being forced into neighboring Bangladesh, where they are going to be housed in refugee camps that resemble prisons. And the Nobel Prize-winning leader of Myanmar, Aung San Suu Kyi, finally broke her silence yesterday. And actually, it's Tuesday, but that would be yesterday based on where I am. And she's been accused of being a victim blamer, burying her head in the sand, and presiding over ethnic cleansing. Now, in a national address that sounded a little bit like Trump's remarks about Charlottesville, Suu Kyi condemned all human rights violations and unlawful violence, but she failed to condemn alleged atrocities carried out by the Myanmar military against the Rohingya Muslims. And PBS had some good reporting on the NewsHour last night from the scene, where it's clear that the Myanmar soldiers are burning villages, they are shooting and killing people at will, they are raping women in a very public way. I mean, this is a clear form of ethnic cleansing. Now, the side of the story from the Myanmar officials is that there are radical Rohingyas who have taken up arms and that this must be dealt with. But I think that's a smokescreen. Certainly, there are people radicalized by this, and if they were burning your house, would you just sit idly by and pick up your belongings and move to Bangladesh? Well, Suu Kyi is really in a hot seat. And it appears that this is going to go on for some time. Now, she claims action will be taken against all people, regardless of their religion, race, and political position, who go against the law of the land and violate human rights. But Amnesty International's director for Southeast Asia, James Gomez, said this is little more than a mix of untruths and victim blaming. Suu Kyi today demonstrated that she and her government are still burying their heads in the sand over the horrors unfolding in Rakhine State. There's overwhelming evidence that security forces are engaged in a campaign of ethnic cleansing through murder and forced displacement. And I hope the UN will take this issue up and intervene as soon as possible. New leak-based information coming from major media outlets, the New York Times and CNN, related to the Trump-Russia investigation. And we're always told, that Bob Mueller is running such a tight operation, there aren't going to be any leaks from the special counsel. Well, these leaks pretty clearly came from there, because we're told that prosecutors, when they raided Manafort's home, they had an enhanced search warrant that enabled them to pick the lock on his front door. They didn't trust him. They were afraid he would destroy evidence when they announced themselves. And they also brushed him back and said that they are planning to indict him. Now, the theory is that they're trying to flip Manafort into testifying against Trump or others. And that may be the case. And it's clear to me, and I don't make a lot of predictions, but Manafort and Mike Flynn, the one-time national security advisor to Trump, I believe that they are both going to be indicted and likely will be convicted because they failed to report their fees and income from overseas, and there was a lot of shady behavior that went on. And the New York Times points out that Mueller is being really muscular, particularly with Manafort and Flynn, while people who still work at the White House are invited to come in and testify before the grand jury. He issues subpoenas and search warrants to the people he's playing hardball with. Now, it's interesting because the next targets, we're told, about the grand jury include the heads of two consulting firms, Mercury Public Affairs and the Podesta Group. Now, that's run by John Podesta's brother, Tony. John did help originally co-found it, but we're told he no longer has any interest in the Podesta Group. However, the association of the two brothers is going to lead many people to think in a suspicious way. And curiously, Mueller has also taken the unusual step of issuing a subpoena to a lawyer for Manafort. Typically, the lawyers are protected by the attorney-client privilege, but apparently there's some basis where it may not apply, and there are really more questions than answers coming from these leak-based reports. Before we get to the next one that is coming out of CNN, I want to note that the scrappy independent media outlet Shadowproof got a notification from the FBI just a few hours before the New York Times report surfaced and the CNN report surfaced regarding the claim by President Trump in a tweet that Obama had Trump Tower wiretapped. Now, the Bureau previously said that they had no records. Both the FBI and the National Security Director confirmed they have no records related to wiretaps as described by the March 4th, 2017 tweets from Trump. But the document released to Shadowproof shifted that to it can neither confirm nor deny the existence of records regarding a wiretap of Trump Tower. Now, this next report from CNN, again, it is unsourced. We have no idea where it's coming from and the credibility of the secret source. But CNN reports that the government snooping of Paul Manafort began in 2014 with wiretaps that were authorized by the super-secret FISA court. Now, that would have been related to Manafort's role in the re-election campaign of Viktor Yanukovych, who was the subject of a U.S.-backed coup in Ukraine in 2014. So in the fine print, it says that that first warrant led to surveillance that was discontinued at some point last year for lack of evidence. So the fact that there was surveillance that led to no investigation beyond that or a prosecution of Manafort is kind of downplayed by the sensational news that he was subjected to a FISA court wiretap. Then we're told the FBI restarted the surveillance after obtaining a new FISA warrant that extended at least into early this year. But we don't know the start date of that 2016 warrant. We don't know if FBI Director Comey initiated it. And what this shows, well, two things. First of all, Paul Manafort had an apartment in Trump Tower. So Trump's tweet may be narrowly correct, even if the wiretaps only related to Manafort and didn't involve any of his calls with Trump. But this will enable Trump supporters and the gang at Breitbart to say, look, Trump was right. Trump Tower was wiretapped because we now know that the FISA court authorized the wiretapping of Manafort. The other piece here, just on the face of it, James Comey did not play fair. And this is one of Hillary Clinton's biggest beefs. That Comey essentially exonerated her on July 6th. Then in October, because of the Wiener laptop, said we're reopening the investigation. Then right before the election said never mind. Well, it's pretty clear that Manafort's second wiretap was in play at the times that Comey announced the reopening and the never mind related to Clinton's emails. And I consider it grossly unfair that he broke protocol to explain that about Clinton and didn't explain that the former campaign manager for Trump was also under investigation. In the same reporting attributed to the New York Times about the shock and awe tactics used by Mueller, well, it says Mueller has obtained a flurry of subpoenas to compel witnesses to testify before his grand jury, sometimes before his prosecutors have even taken the customary first step of interviewing them. What we don't know is if his agents are using national security letters that were widely abused by the FBI when Bob Mueller was running the Federal Bureau of Investigation. These are the powers enhanced by the Patriot Act that expanded the muscle of the FBI and reduced any kind of accountability or any kind of watchdog role for Congress in evaluating whether the FBI operates inside the law. So I watched Rachel Maddow last night. Her blood pressure was way up. She's so excited about all this stuff. But keep in mind that it's quite possible that Manafort and Flynn could be convicted for their failure to report their ties to foreign governments without proving that there was manipulation of the election, that the DNC was hacked by Russians, and that information was given to WikiLeaks by Russians, and that was destined to cause Trump to win and Clinton to lose. But that is the conflation that you get if you watch Rachel Maddow's coverage of these issues. Now, I mentioned Hillary Clinton, and I'm mildly pleased to hear that in an interview with NPR's Terry Gross, the Fresh Air host, that she objected to the legitimacy of Trump's election. Now, it went off the rails when she compared it to Kenya and the recent election there, where Kenya's Supreme Court annulled the results of the re-election that was first awarded to President Kenyatta. And Clinton said that both her loss and the election in Kenya were projects of Cambridge Analytica. Now, she's wrong on the facts, because the issues in Kenya related to the transfer of votes, the tabulation. Now, Cambridge Analytica was working for Kenyatta. They worked for him on his last election, and Cambridge Analytica is one of my chief suspects in the manipulation of our election in 2016, because Trump spent somewhere over $85 million on Facebook ads that were targeted by the data collected and massaged by Cambridge Analytica. And that included Facebook data that so far we haven't seen anybody else really master the manipulation of. So Hillary went on to say that she's only beginning to delve into what happened in Kenya, but that she saw that the Supreme Court there threw out the election. We have no such provision in our country, and usually we don't need it. Well, Hillary, what about 2000? What about 2004? And I'm glad you're raising these issues. But from everything I know, the ship has sailed. The opportunity to contest the election was available last year. In the state-level post-election contests of the vote count, in the process of the Electoral College, and in the certification of the election by the U.S. Senate. And I don't believe it could be reopened at this point. Legal scholars may have special loopholes and angles, but I'm not aware of one that would overturn the election, even if it's shown in the worst case that everything that Rachel Maddow is imagining is true. And while I am pleased to see Mrs. Clinton acknowledge the chicanery that went on, she failed to really contest it in a timely manner. It's going to be with us for a while. Thanks for listening to my News and Comment podcast. We do this daily, and this podcast is available on YouTube. I'm Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.